Bob Roswick of the Bismarck Air Museum. With me today is Tom Trousdale, our docent, to talk about the Vickers Viscount. How are you doing today, Tom?
Great, ready to roll, Bob.
In the last episode, we were talking a little bit about DC-6s, and we're going to kind of jump the gun. We did talk about this airplane briefly in the last episode in a sale when Northwest or Capital Airlines was considering being buying Northwest Airlines. We talked about these planes because they're a little bit faster. Tell us what you know about this plane, Tom.
Well, the Vickers Viscount was actually the first jet-powered airliner that was ever used. It was developed by the British. The initial one could go about 350 miles an hour. It would hold 44 people. Capital Airlines, the American carrier, looked at it and went over and flew on it and liked what they saw. They particularly liked the ability of the airplane to go faster than the DC-6s and the DC-7s of like American Airlines and TWA and United Airlines, because this could go 50 to 60 miles an hour faster. So they put it on. The initial run that they used was between Washington, D.C. and Chicago. And up until they put it on, they were competing against the major carriers, and they probably had 10% of the market if they had that. Within a week, they had captured 35% of the market because the airplane could go faster. And Capital went one step further, and their tagline for the Viscount was jet speed, jet style, jet food. And the jet food was brought out by, we'll cook your steak the way that you like it on the way to Chicago. And of course, businessmen ate that up. So everybody was flying Viscounts. And another airline in the United States looked at it, and that was Continental. Bob Six liked what he saw after Capital Airlines started buying them. They started out with 15, and by the time Capital Airlines was done, they had 60 of them. So they replaced almost all their aircraft in the fleet that they had with jet-powered, Rolls-Royce powered, and of course that was a big selling factor too. These are Rolls-Royce engines. So everybody liked the idea of the Rolls-Royce engine. It was vibration-free, and it went 50 miles an hour faster than the piston-powered airlines that the American Airlines were flying at the time.
So I think what's important to understand here is that this competed with what airplanes? What were the domestic carriers using that this competed with?
Well, this competed with everything. Northwest was still flying DC-4s, so these just literally walked away from the DC-4s. United and American Airlines were flying DC-6s and DC-7s, and they were burning out their engines. The DC-7 could get up to 400 miles an hour, but it was a fantastic strain on the engine, and unless the engines were turbo compound, and we'll get into that later, but unless you really watched them very, very closely, you could also burn out an engine trying to keep up with a Viscount. So, and TWA's Constellations were the same way. They just couldn't quite hack it to get up to 400 miles an hour.
So the thing I'm learning with this, Tom, is that the British actually did have a little bit of an edge on the U.S. when it came to aircraft. They were darn good at it.
They were darn good at it. They started out with the Viscount, and they started out with the Comet, and we'll talk about the Comet down the road. The only problem was with the Comet, on the Comet they had square windows, the initial Comet, and they found out later on that that was where the Comets had an unfortunate habit of blowing up in flight, and that was caused by metal fatigue and air stresses on the window frames that were square. You'll notice on the Viscount the windows are all round, and that was one thing they learned. So to pressurize an aircraft and go up to 30,000 feet, the window has to be round so that it has to have better reinforcements, which they didn't have on the Comet either, so that it doesn't have metal fatigue and explode.
So tell us, Tom, a little bit about airplanes breathing.
Well, that really gets it gets technical, Bob. But what we're talking about is if you're on a conventional airliner, the airliners today fly anywhere from 15,000 feet to 42,000 feet on the 777. The problem was that the DC-4 couldn't go above 10,000 feet because it wasn't pressurized. Pressurized simply means that the air inside the aircraft, if you took a conventional piston engine DC-6, let's say, and put it up at 10,000 feet, the air inside the aircraft is pressurized, so you're not breathing the air as if you were at 10,000 feet. You're breathing the air as if you were at 7,000 feet. And by breathing, it simply means that the fuselage is pressurized, and the best example would be is if you put it in water, you would see how pressurization works. It keeps out the water and keeps the air on the inside, and that's basically when we talk about pressurization and airplanes breathing. When we get to the Comet, I'll have an interesting tale about airplanes breathing.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of models here. This one is, what does BOAC stand for?
British Overseas Airways Corporation, and it was the premier carrier for Britain. The interesting thing on this, and again, the British were very conservative when they built their airplanes, and again, this was after the Comet. Put your little pointer on the cockpit windows, Bob, right there, yeah. You'll notice 3 little windows there. Rather than have a big window for the side for the pilot to look out, they put little braces in there and had 3 little windows. You look on Viscounts later on, and they did away with that. But they were very, very cautious because they had suffered the explosions of the Comet.
For those new to aviation, tell me, Tom, why are there only 2 engines running on this airplane?
Because it's a factor to save fuel and for a quick turnaround. These are turbine powered, and if you've ever watched an engine spool up or take off, a turbine engine, they spin for quite a while after you have shut them off. And this is basically to save fuel and to cut down on the noise. The British had an interesting example. They called the airplane the Whistling Willie, because if you've ever heard a turbine, the Electra had a little bit of a whistle or a whine, but the Rolls-Royce definitely had a whine. You didn't hear it on the inside of the cabin, but you definitely heard it on the outside.
All right, I think we have another picture here of seating. And so what do we have for seating in this thing? What were the various arrangements?
Well, this looks like, again, probably a typical cabin. It's 800 series, though, and we were talking about that earlier. I think what this is, and again, let's bring our arrow up to right behind the boarding stairs. I think what that is actually a first-class cabin, and the British love to seat people because it is a lot safer, facing not the front of the aircraft, but towards the rear. And I think that is an example of, they called it Elizabethan class. I think that's an example of their first class section.
And how many seats are we talking?
On this one, you could get up to 86 seats on this, because this is a stretched Viscount or the Viscount 800 series.
We're going to continue talking about the Vickers in episode 7. The Bismarck Air Museum Foundation is trying to capture and restore the building you see before you, the large round-top hangar at the Bismarck Airport known as Hangar Number 5. Log on to our website at bismarckairmuseum.org. Give us a donation. Log on to Facebook under Bismarck Air Museum. Subscribe to this channel on YouTube. I'd like to credit Jerry McLaughlin for some of our photos, Wikipedia, and the Bismarck Aero Center for providing this photo. Once again, I'd like to thank Tom for helping us understand these iconic photos.